Here we've got some existing VMs, and we're going to go ahead and attach some additional data disks. Now, when VMs are created, they generally have an operating system disk and a temporary drive. We want to go in now and begin adding workloads to this VMs that require some data disks. The number of data disks is determined by the class or the type of virtual machine that you deploy. The larger the size of the VM, typically the larger the number of disks. And different classes of VMs allow different numbers of disks. So knowing what your workload is, knowing how many disks you think that you're going to need, goes into sizing and choosing the right size of VM when you deploy it. Now, these VMs are pretty straightforward VMs, and they each support, from memory, about 4 or 8 data disks. So these are standard DS4 V3s. And they support, I think, 8 data disks from memory. So we're going to go ahead and add to this. Well, actually, I got 2 types, just to point that out first. I got an unmanaged server, so unmanaged disks, and a server with managed disks. We'll start with the unmanaged disks server. So it's a pretty straightforward process. I go to disks, and I can now add additional data disks. So the source is going to be empty, so it's going to create a new disk. Or I could actually, if I uploaded a VHD, for example, I could actually select the VHD that I uploaded. Let's say I've got a lot of files I want to transfer from an on-premise VM into an Azure VM. I can upload that to my storage blob and attach it directly. So we're going to create a new one. It's premium. We'll take the size, the default size of 1 terabyte, and then choose our storage account that's going to contain this disk, as well as the container in the storage account. Azure will take care of naming the disk, or giving us a default name here. We can obviously change that if we want, but we'll accept the default for now. Click OK, and then click Save, and we'll see that we have this disk attached. And so this will add the data disk to this virtual machine that's using unmanaged storage. For managed storage, the process is very, very similar, but there's one small difference. It's actually a little bit simpler. We'll come back into the disks on the managed disk server, click Add Data Disk, create a new data disk, give it a name, call this one extra storage. And what this is actually doing is creating a managed disk object that's actually going to reside in the resource group. Again, source can be either a storage blob or in this case, a snapshot of another disk. We'll go none, which it'll be empty. We'll click OK. And you'll notice with this, we're not picking the storage account. We're merely picking the resource group where the managed disk object is going to be created. So this will go ahead and create the managed disk and attach it to the VM. So let that job run. It takes just a couple of seconds. And we can see it's now attached. Save this configuration, and it will go update the underlying virtual machine. Now, we can also pre-create these disks. I actually use the wizard to create the disk. I can actually pre-create the managed disk object through the marketplace. Do a search for managed disk. And so here we can actually see where we can create a managed disk object. I've already got one created, so we're just going to go back, go to my virtual machines, go to the managed server, disks. And so actually, in fact, before we do that, let's go to our resource groups, go to this add disks resource group that I'm using at the moment. And you can see here we've got a couple of managed disk objects. So here we go. So there's the disk. So we've got this extra storage one I created. And here's a data disk one that I created earlier. We can actually go attach that one to the VM. So come back to our disks, hit our browse list, and here it is right here. So these are all the disks in my resource group. Save it, and it will go in and attach that disk. Now, we can also do all this in PowerShell, and here's what it looks like. So I've got some basic variables, the name of the resource group, the name of the server, the location, the storage SKU, and then just a name for the disk file itself. We then use a new Azure RM disk config to create the disk configuration. which includes things like our storage type, location, etc., the size. We then use a new RM data disk to create the disk and feed it the configuration that we created in the previous command, name of the disk, name of the resource group, get our VM object, add the data disk to the VM, and then update the configuration. So we'll go ahead and run this command. Again, this will take just a few minutes to run. PowerShell's complete. Let's go back and take a look at our VM. So here's our managed server. Have a look at our disk configuration. And you can see now we've got extra storage as well as the 2 additional data disks attached. Now, removing disks from servers is a pretty simple process. Well, it can be done by PowerShell, or right here in the portal, we just click this little detach icon and it will detach all those disks. The disk objects themselves are still preserved. The data doesn't go away. You've just essentially done the Azure equivalent of unplug the hard drive from the virtual machine in Azure. So those disks will disappear from within the VM. If you go in Server Manager, disks are gone. So there you have it. That is attaching and detaching Azure disks to Azure VMs for both managed and unmanaged storage, both in the PowerShell, in the portal, and in PowerShell.